One thing which you mentioned, which I think is a good place to start, particularly because it's something relevant to stuff we've been talking about in our Discord server recently, and that's like the way um, the Orthodox Church reads Scripture and the way we see Scripture. Because we have um, we have a friend in the server who is very adamant about uh, seeing distinguishing between the Protestant understanding of infallibility and inerrancy, the inerrancy of scripture, and the Orthodox view of scripture, which he sees as more like focusing on the symbolic or the allegorical interpretation of scripture. And to me and to all of us in this call, this just seems to be introducing a false dialectic here, where there is an opposition between the literal, if you want to call it that, the literal historical reading of scripture, and then the allegorical or symbolic view of scripture. And you've said this before in some video about inspiring philosophy, who makes the argument that not only can we read Genesis, the first chapters of Genesis, not as a literal historical narrative, but it's a better reading of Scripture or of Genesis to read it as purely allegorical. So I was just wondering if maybe you could go a little deeper into the traditional Orthodox way of reading Scripture, whether inerrancy is a valid category that we can use to describe the Bible, or whether it's just a fundamentalist Protestant novel way of reading the Scripture.
Yeah, there's a really good book called The Christians as the Romans Saw Them by Robert Louis Wilkin, I think is his name. And in this book, he makes a really important point, which people today tend to forget or not be aware of at all, which is that it was a flashpoint of early Christian pagan controversies about the historicity of the Bible. Pagans routinely made criticisms of Christians on the basis that the biblical narratives were not credible as historical narratives. Now, if this is true, that the Orthodox Church skirts around that by somehow saying, well, we don't really take it historically, we take it allegorically, well, then their response should have been something like that. But in fact, what you see is something like what Augustine did. Augustine tried to calculate the precise dimensions of the ark and explain precisely how all the animals in the world could fit into the ark's dimensions as he calculated them. Now, if this was presented today on an Orthodox website, you would see gobs of comments saying, this is just imported from Protestant fundamentalism. This is something you got from your Protestant background. It sounds like you haven't fully converted to Orthodoxy yet. But Protestantism didn't exist in Augustine's day. Or perhaps a really striking example would be the controversy over the book of Daniel in the early centuries of the church, where one of Christianity's most intellectually astute and able critics, Porphyry, wrote extensively about the prophecies in the book of Daniel and argued that the book was a forgery that was attempting to prophesy after the fact during the period of the Maccabean revolt, which, for those who aren't aware, was a revolt which ended in the cleansing of the temple and the beginning of the festival of Hanukkah. And for those who aren't aware, this narrative about the book of Daniel's production and forgery is precisely the conventional narrative within the secular liberal academy today. And I have seen Christians attempt to kind of bring this on wholesale as if it were just a given, and as if any criticism of this point was a Protestant importation or based on Protestant assumptions. But in fact, long before was any such thing as Protestantism, this exact controversy was playing out in the intellectual circles of the first 4 centuries of the Christian era. So we have plenty of reason to think that we should expect the Bible to be historical if the traditional interpretation of Scripture is true. But let's go a little deeper than that. You can look at recent centuries and look at saints of the Orthodox Church who never lived in a Protestant context, saints like St. John of Kronstadt, who says things like, every word of Scripture is true, and it's obvious which bits of Scripture are just meant to be parables. Like the parables of Jesus are not historical. They obviously were never intended to be historical, but where it is intended to be historical, we have to take it as historical. You can find lots of saints and fathers of the Church talking about the necessity of affirming an historical interpretation of Scripture, where the intention of the author is historical. And in fact, you find lots of discussions about the importance of the intention of the author in interpreting Scripture and in discerning where there is and isn't a contradiction in the Bible. And to go even deeper than that, why is it important to affirm the historicity of Scripture beyond the mere fact that we want to say Scripture is inerrant? And to say that it is inerrant is to say that the Scriptures, as the authors intended, has no genuine contradictions within it. That is something that plenty of saints said, and they even talk about this being something located in the original manuscript tradition, and it is true about the text as we have it insofar as it represents the original manuscript tradition. That's something that Augustine says very straightforwardly. That's not a 19th century Protestant thing at all. Well, why is it important to say that the Scriptures are historical? We want to affirm absolutely that they are allegorical. They have lots and lots of spiritual meaning. But why do we care about those allegories? Well, it's because the Bible is telling us about the meaning that is inherent in the real, true, concrete world. So here's an example from the Gospel of John. In John chapter 20, when Jesus is raised from the dead, Peter and John go running to the tomb, and when they enter into the tomb, they find sitting on either side of Jesus' burial stone two angels. Now, this is a symbol or an allegory of the Holy of Holies, where there are two cherubim on either side of the mercy seat. And this is congruent with a long-running theme in John's Gospel, where Jesus is depicted both as the God of Israel, the great I Am who bears the name of God, and as the great high priest who progressively ascends through the furniture of the tabernacle and reveals its meaning as centering around himself. Now, that's a clear allegory which is presented to us in John chapter 20. But the resurrection of Jesus is not thereby demonstrated to be non-historical. Instead, what we find in this is that God is the providential ordainer of all history. These allegories and these meanings that we find in the Bible are not something that is superimposed upon the real true world, as if the true world did not really possess them. Rather, what they do for us is they express to us and they tell us what the real world actually means. And I think many people, even if they don't articulate this idea explicitly, then turn to the real world and say, but we don't actually find these symbols. We don't actually find these patterns in the real world. And I think the reason for that is that they just aren't looking hard enough. I think if you look at all sorts of events in church history, events in local communities, and even events in your own personal life, you find that there's a lot more pattern to it than you would assume if you were not looking for it. So the historical meaning of Scripture is important precisely because it tells us why we should care about the allegorical meaning of Scripture. The historical meaning of Scripture is important because it pulls the allegories of Scripture into our real true world and leads us to read the real world differently than we would have otherwise. If, in fact, allegory and history are in natural tension with each other, the implication of that is that anything which is concrete, anything which really happens in the world, should be assumed not to have any genuine meaning. And that is just absolutely contrary, not only to orthodoxy, but I just think to Christianity in general.
All heart Nate, do you have anything to add to that? Or you can ask a different question, anything.
No, that was good. I think that was a great way of putting it, and I hope that our friend who we mentioned in the Discord sees this video.
Oh, we'll send it to him. Okay, so something that you mentioned.
Real quick, one thing I want to ask. Sorry about that, but
no worries.
one question was, what do you think about certain statements? I don't know if you're aware of them, Sarah, in the Church Fathers. Specifically, I'm thinking of an example from Saint Gregory of Nyssa. If you don't know to what I'm referring to, that's fine. But he'll basically talk about in Life of Moses, which I have right here. He speaks of basically, at least our friend likes to interpret one of his statements as basically meaning that, the Exodus didn't actually have to have happened for us to derive significant meaning from it, and for it to inform our lives and be important. And I was wondering if you've encountered that passage from Saint Gregory of Nyssa used as a kind of by the way, in Orthodoxy we don't actually view the historicity of the scriptures to be that significant. So yeah, what do you think of that proof text that they like to throw out?
Yeah, I mean, it's this is kind of like the issue of whether you interpret Genesis 1 as describing an historical narrative. And you'll notice that when people say the church fathers didn't interpret it historically, they always refer to the exact same passage, which is Augustine's literal meaning of Genesis. And that's because it's essentially the only one they really have. So this passage from Gregory of Nyssa is referring specifically to the destruction of the Egyptian children on the night of Passover. But the interesting thing about Gregory of Nyssa, and I think he's just wrong on this point, but I think the interesting point is that Gregory of Nyssa says this because he's making an argument that Moses intended us not to take this as historical in the first place. Now, if somebody wants to make that argument, we can have it on exegetical grounds, but that's the argument that we have to have. What you're dealing with when you have people who say, well, we just take this as allegory, full stop, is in general, in fact, I've never encountered an example, though I'm sure there are examples in the contemporary world somewhere. In general, they are never willing to actually defend the idea that it was the intention of the author to exclude historicity from our point of view. It is rather that, well, they meant it as historical. The authors wrote this as historical, but because of modern biblical criticism or because of archaeology or something like that, we can no longer take it that way, but we can still derive allegorical meaning from it. So Gregory of Nyssa here is kind of drawing on Origen, and Origen said that the genealogies in scriptures is just one example. There's obviously no, significance to them in themselves, which is a clue that we should be reading them as something else. Well, I would contest the premise of that question, and it's a premise that has not been received into the broad tradition of the church. So if you read St. John Chrysostom talks about some of the most kind of you might call them obscene events in the book of Judges. So he takes Jephthah's sacrifice of his daughter to be an actual sacrifice. I actually think it was a ascension to the tabernacle. She was consecrated as a permanent virgin, but he takes it as a literal sacrifice. And if it was the general rule, if it is the normative tradition to take those disturbing passages as purely allegorical and exclude them from the realm of historicity, this is where you would do it. But he doesn't do that at all. Instead, he assumes that it's historical. He doesn't even seem to think to contest the premise, and he goes on to explain how he thinks it fits with God's providence and so on and so forth. So I think that Gregory of Nyssa here, there's the reason that's the only passage that is virtually ever cited, because it's really the only one from which you could support this thing. And even when it's taken on its own term, it's not precisely the way that modern people would defend the idea of allegory in scripture as the only legitimate interpretation. And on top of that, this is one of those areas where he's depending on Origen's hermeneutic, and Origen is one of the most, I would say, theologically unreliable people in the history of the church. So it's in precisely those areas where you find things like this.
And one thing to add there, you mentioned that basically Origen was proposing that the genealogies don't have inherent meaning to them, or then we shouldn't consider them as being historical as a result of that. One way to rebuff that, I think, would be just the fact that scripture speaks of man as being the generations of the heavens and the earth, which is of course the language you find in the genealogies, which shows that the format of genealogy does actually communicate a more allegorical meaning. And so yeah, you can't undercut the genealogies in that way, I don't think.
Yeah, and it's notable that Origen has a kind of a radically non-Christian and non-biblical view of the history of the cosmos, where there's an eternal cosmos, and we all pre-existed this. So it's interesting that this comes up, particularly in relation to the genealogies, which I think, at least in its subtext, strongly contradicts this whole cosmology.